Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is a round 6 game from the 2015 Tata Steel chess tournament between the world's top two players, Fabiano Caruana, playing as white, world number 2, against the current world champion Magnus Carlsen. Let's have a look. We have Caruana opening with e4, Carlsen replying with the Sicilian defense, knight f3, knight c6, we have the Rossolimo, and we go in for that bishop for knight exchange. White is now combating this light square bishop, these next two moves, that unopposed light square bishop. d3 and h3 are there. And after a couple more natural moves, we have b6, which is not the most common 7th move in this opening, in this variation. More common is knight d7 or castles. Knight d7 facilitates e5, looks to circle around, drop the knight into d4 or f4. But by playing b6, we are at least on the black side retaining some flexibility, not so quick to move towards the queen side, even if just for one move. Not so quick to go in that direction. As we'll see in the game, he has a different idea in mind. So as a follow-up, it's bishop e3, exerting pressure on c5, paving the way for a battery. Exchanging dark square bishops, not a bad idea when combating the bishop pair. And this will also tie in well with queenside play. As a follow-up, we have e5. And I'd like to draw your attention to the clock times. Up to this point, Carlsen hasn't spent so much time, and I'm bringing this up because I believe it's influencing the play, at least at this moment here for this move 9. The decision to capture or not, we can be sure that it's going to become a much more dynamic position if knight takes e is played. And if you're thinking your opponent is still well in preparation, it's maybe a wise decision to simply steer clear of this particular line, even if the evaluation would be reading whatever, that white is, let's say, slightly better. If you don't feel comfortable enough going into a critical, dynamic type position, maybe wise to just steer clear of it. And that's what we have in the game. We have castles instead of knight takes e. If we have a look at it, knight takes e would be met with knight takes. If we have an immediate recapture on e, this is absolutely no problem. Black is the one who benefits. The bishop pair is still around, and more pieces, more pawns, I should say, have been exchanged, and that's only benefiting black. But what could follow is after knight takes e, queen f3. This is a different story, putting pressure on f7. f5 is a reply. And now after bishop f4, queen e7, this is as far as I want to take it. Again, it's a sharp position if you're not comfortable with it. Again, not a good feeling to think your opponent is no longer human, but rather, this top chess engine like Stockfish. If you're not feeling comfortable prep-wise, maybe a good decision to go with castles instead of this capture. So that's what we have. Castles it is. Black follows suit. White gets on with queenside play. Black stops it for the moment. And now queen to b1. White really wants to get this in. If the pawn is allowed to get to b4, we can say, well, actually, regardless of what black does next, there will be some weakness imposed on the black queen side pawn structure. If you're playing a5 to stop this advance, you're weakening b6. And if you allow the b4 advance, what's going to happen? Well, let's see. What happens in the game is knight h5. We're seeing that different intention by the knight. He's now drifting towards the white king, looking to drop into f4 one day, and also it's clearing the way for f5. b4 is now on board, and this is the situation black now finds himself in. To take or just let the pawn sit. If you're taking, you're helping the rook out, which is a reason to not have had the rook play to b1 to facilitate this advance. If this capture is happening, the rook is brought right to life. And if you're not capturing, well, what's going to happen? Well, let's see. It's what happened in the game. f5 was played, and now b takes c. f4 is played first, the bishop is kicked back, and now b takes c. So this is the cost. Black, when they were in the position to take on b4 right here, at this stage, after b4, to take or not, well, if you're taking, you're helping out the rook, and if you don't take, you're going to have double isolated c-pawns. That's apparently what black prefers to have, double isolated c-pawns, instead of bringing the white rook to life. So f5 is on board, f4, and only then b takes c. So with this last move, second last move, with this pawn shift here, gaining a tempo against the bishop, this structure starts to remind us of a King's Indian defense, or in other words, where black looks to play on the king side of the board, and white, on the other hand, will look to play on the queen side of the board. And that's certainly where white can be playing. There are weaknesses there that can be targeted, and that's exactly what Caruana goes for. He looks to target this weakened c5 pawn with both queen and knight. And that's what we have taking shape next. Starting first with queen b3, bishop e6, queen a4. She's looking to drop into a5. And she's also putting pressure on c6. That needs to be tended to. If he falls, it's what's interesting here is that generally you see double isolated pawns as very weak, but this pawn here might be one of the most valuable pawns in the position. He's controlling a very critical square, d5. Without him around, this knight's going to drop right into the position. So you need to do something about that. It's defended with rook to c8. Now queen a5. Pressure on c5, vacating now a4 for the knight. c5 is soon to collapse, so black needs to come up with something, and he does. He's pushing forward with a very clear plan, something we would again see in the King's Indian defense, looking for a pawn break g4. White gets on with it, knight a4, g4, h takes g. That's not the only move. Excuse me. You could play queen takes c5, but I believe this would simply transpose to the game. After queen takes c5, they would follow queen f6, and then this capture would happen. If you're capturing at this stage right here after queen takes c, queen takes queen, knight takes queen, notice the bishop is hit. So pawn takes knight, knight takes bishop. So after this g4 advance, we have the immediate capture. Bishop takes, and only now queen takes c5. Queen f6. And now knight to h2. This is a big decision here. There's also not a lot of time. There's been a lot of time invested by Caruana at this stage. And black is threatening to absolutely crush the white kingside pawn structure. This is a very human-like move, but there was quite a bit of calculation needed at this stage to do something other than knight to h2. The computer suggestion is to get this rook all the way over here with the idea to allow this capture and have the king sneak over in this direction. And that's actually quite scary. Your king is not going to be able to tuck himself in so easily on that e2 square. For example, after queen h4, you can't just make a mad dash towards that e2 square. King f1 right away can be met with knight g4. This is just going to be very, very bad news for Team White. If you're not capturing the knight, well, here comes yet another piece into the attack. And if you are capturing the knight, this is bad news. All three of these pieces, queen, pawn, and rook, are ready to crush that white king. So you can't, let me run with this once more. You can't run to f1 right away. However, you could play king g2, but this is like very difficult to see this type of move. King to g2, because it's really asking for more trouble with rook f6 to g6 stuff, but apparently you can hold this on the white side, and it's very scary for sure. bishop to b4, looking to clear the way one day for maybe a king to c3 move if need be. For example, if we have this check now, there can follow king f1, queen h2, king e2. There's a knight check that can be given. There's also rook g2, bishop to e1, and the king is looking to run over like so. This is very difficult to see, I would imagine, especially with so little time, under 20 minutes, or just about 20 minutes, to calculate this structural change, and also to know that you can't just be going very quickly to the e2 square. That was my initial thought, but it's tactically flawed. To have to meet queen h4 with king to g2, you're really having to have an iron stomach, I guess you could say. You're really asking for trouble with this rook g6 stuff. So instead it was, again, the more human-like move, knight to h2, and now this is allowing a big shift in the game. We have the follow-up f3. Now this knight h2 move, it wasn't, well, it seemed like it was throwing a punch at the bishop, and it is, but it isn't something black has to react to, is what I'm getting at. f3 is, one way to summarize this is, well, it's acting as a giant thorn, for one, in the white king position, and two, I view it as helping out both minor pieces. This knight will now one day be able to make use of f4 and pretty much be intolerable. So he'll have to be taken, and then when he is, this bishop will be brought right to life, and he'd even be gaining a tempo on that a1 rook. So this is where there's a big shift. Black now starts to be the better side. He's the better side on the clock and just objectively as well. As a follow-up, he does go in for knight takes bishop. The reply here, queen g6, will win that knight right back. You can't just move the knight and defend the mate on g2 because knight f4 is a killer. What are you going to do now? g3, that's a mate in 1, and then 2, or if you like, a different square. So you can't just play knight to e3. Knight f4 is going to be killer. So instead you have to go for a queen exchange. Queen e7 it is. There's two ways to go about that. I'm not sure if there's much difference. Queen e7 or e3, and then dropping into g5, looking for a queen exchange, and white manages that. Queen e7, pawn takes. Rook has to move. You can't take that pawn. You're going to get killed. It's going to be a mate already. Rook f3, h3 stuff happening right away. So the rook has to move. He goes to an open file. Queen takes knight. Black got that piece back. And now queen g5. We have a bit of a repetition here. Queen e2, queen e3. White wants to get the queens off the board and will be successful with doing that. So they're exchanged, but there's still some problems here for Team White related to that knight f4 move. Keeping a close eye on that g2 pawn. He's just a single square away from queening. May seem a bit odd to view it like that, but it does play a role. Also looking at simply a fork to pick up that bishop. So he's pretty much intolerable. Bishop takes knight, pawn takes. Unleashes the bishop, and is just a moment away from having a connected pass pawn. So if you're reacting, in other words, to this threat against your rook at this stage, with c3, this is a killer. f3, with then rook f6, h6, mate. There's not going to be a good defense to that. And we could see how quickly both players, well, I should say, you could see how quickly Caruana understood that. Just looking at the clock, after bishop takes, knight, pawn takes, 11 minutes, 18 seconds roughly. It's played very quickly. King takes g2. Again, there's a 30-second increment here, so he recognized that you just cannot allow that pawn on g2. You need to just give up the exchange. But black is not so quick to invest that bishop for knight exchange. He's looking at different ideas. The follow-up here is f3. Maybe he'll take the rook, maybe he won't. Let's see what your king's going to do first. If you play up to g3, maybe there's a reason to be making use of the e5 square, or maybe better stated, you want to first play f3 so that you keep these options available, where maybe you could question the king being on a dark square over here on the king side. So first it's f3. Let's grab some more information about the white king, and let's also make sure he's not able to find a good home on the f3 square. So f3 first, king f1, and not bishop takes knight. Bishop takes knight would still have an advantage. If we do bishop takes knight, there's still an advantage for black, but it's not so clear. It's much better to go after the king. Getting a rook, let's say, to this h1 square. Rook to f4, not going for material, going for mate instead. c3 saves the rook, cuts off this diagonal, and you could also view it as having now a new square for the king. That's probably the more important feature here, because when the rook is on h4, just trying to run to this d2 square, that's not necessarily a square you can rely upon, because the bishop can play to h6 and control it. So c3 is interfering with bishop takes rook, but primary purpose is to have that c2 square available for the king. As a follow-up, we have rook d8. All three pieces are working. These two right here, they don't move anymore in this game. That's all we had by this knight. Knight c3 to a4, this rook hasn't moved, and it's just there's not a good defense here for white. In the game we had d4, and then the follow-up, bishop to h6. This was not the most convincing move, but it's still going to score the point. A better move would have been rook to h4 immediately, looking for mate, and after king to e1 to crash through on d4 with the bishop. After pawn takes, rook takes, you cannot stop mate. So, and while doing something else, after bishop takes here, if you're, well, this isn't a defense, but just to show it, after rook to d1, this is nothing because you could still take here. It's now a double attack in some sense against the d2 square. After the bishop is captured, that's mate. We didn't have that. We didn't have rook to h4, but instead bishop to h6. The king goes for a little bit of a run, and now this rook is picking up some pawns. c5 is a nice shot here. If you're going in for this rook e2 move, getting on the second rank right away, it could be challenged with rook to b2. The knight is there to defend. And so by playing first c5, if knight takes pawn now this rook to e2 move would be that much more devastating, hitting at f2, and it cannot be challenged with rook to b2. The knight's no longer there to defend. So after c5, we have the king running. This position is getting completely broken down. King d3, rook e2, c4. The king position is secure, but after rook takes pawn, it's black who's now up, 4 pawns to 2. Very active rook, bishop, all pieces playing. There's really no hope here. After rook to e2, Caruana throws in the towel. There's nothing to do here. Down material. Black also has the superior minor piece. Looking at these checks with pawn pushes, 2 passed pawns, it's too much. So, a very interesting game. Right out of the opening, decision points. Looking at preparation a little bit. I believe that influenced play, especially right here to go in for that dynamic play or not. Queenside play, again, similar to what we would have in a King's Indian defense. Black playing on the king side, white going on the queen side, where black is weakened, pinpointing that c5 pawn. Meanwhile, black gets on with a g4 break. And again, right here, you have to have an iron stomach for it, but allowing this type of pawn transformation, it's certainly scary in the face of these 3 pieces attacking your king, but objectively best, but very, very difficult to play for a human. Instead, knight h2, and again, that f3 move allowed the knight and the bishop to spring to life. That f4 square being made use of soon. The queens are off just a little bit, but the attack continued, not giving that bishop up for the rook, instead going for the king's throat, and black, of course, was successful after breaking down this white king position. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care.